And I'm going to bring in Miggy Torres, who did a great job creating a new music piece for Amatria. Hi, Philip. Good to see you. Very, very nice to have you all here. Wonderful.
Hello,
and I think you are in good hands with Devin. I'm going to listen in and just enjoy this music for sentient and human bodies. Take it away.
Thanks for the warm welcome, Kadi. Welcome to the 12 a.m. segment, Music for Human and Sentient Bodies. I'm Devin Wright. I will be ushering our great guests, Miggy Torres and Philip Beesley for this segment. I'm excited to have you guys. So this segment, we'll do a quick intro for both of you, and then we'll go through Miggy's pre-recorded video. Philip will have a live presentation, and then we'll have a 5-minute Q&A for both of you. Does that sound all right for us? All right, wonderful. Take it away, Miggy.
Cool. Great. You can hear me fine and everything? You can hear me? Yeah.
Sounds great.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Miggy Torres. I am a composer and interdisciplinary artist based here in Bloomington, Indiana. First, I want to just say a big thank you to Kati and Andy and to Devin and to the entire CNS team for putting this together and for inviting me to speak here and share this work with so many incredible luminaries in their respective fields. Today, I'll be presenting to you a piece called Autopoetic Bloom that I created in collaboration with CNS and with the Ontario-based Living Architecture Systems Group led by Philip Beesley, who is also speaking today or tomorrow, depending on what your time zone is. This presentation was recorded a few months ago at the CNS Research Showcase. So I'm not going to delve too much into the project right now because you'll be seeing that in the presentation. But I will say that it'll represent kind of departure from everything else that you've seen here today at this event, and probably everything that you're going to see tomorrow as well. You can think of this as a kind of artistic interlude, an island of subjectivity amid an ocean of objectivity that serves in part to remind us that everything we do is, on some level, subjective. This project can be viewed through many different lenses, but two of which I would invite you to consider today. The first is that when you're building a large structure, beginning at the cellular level, you want to have display a kind of emergent behavior. That is to say, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. How do you create a kind of built-in ethics, built-in kind of architecture of ethics, if you will, for that structure? And the second lens through which you may choose to think about this project is that of sustainability. I'm sure Philip will talk much more about this when he gives his presentation, but a large part of what living architecture is all about is sustainability, not just from an environmental or economic point of view, but also from an emotional or psychosocial point of view. And so one question that this work poses is, how do we embed the technologies that we create with a kind of emotional or psychosocial sustainability? So if you enjoy this presentation, there's a longer version of it on my website, and I will be here for questions at the end after Philip's presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Miggy. I can go ahead and play the video if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
So welcome everybody to the CNS Research Showcase this week. We are looking forward to a really fantastic talk by Miggy. So first, to get the official part out of the way, the CNS Research Showcase is a bi-weekly research event organized by our lab, Kadi Bono's lab, in the Department of Intelligent Systems Engineering, where we invite external and sometimes internal speakers to present research and development as it is relevant to our mission, which is typically data visualization and atlasing efforts. We are also very happy to be part of the caretaking group of Amatria, which I'm sure Miggy is going to cover in his talk to a certain degree. So Miggy himself is a composer, artist, and also we are lucky to have him as an IT user support specialist here in our school. And the title of today's talk will be Autopoetic Bloom, a musical improvisation engine for sentient architectural systems. Miggy, the stage is yours.
Yay, thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, Andy. And big thanks to your group for inviting me to talk. This is super exciting. Let me share my screen and we can get started here. I'm on a Windows machine today, which is sacrilegious, I know, since I'm the Mac person here, but pay no attention to the activate Windows on the bottom right. So, Autopoetic Bloom, as Andy said, it's a mood-based improvisation engine for sentient architecture systems. My name is Miggy Torres, and I am a composer and artist. Just a little breakdown of today's talk. I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself, a quick summary of what Autopoetic Bloom is, and then we'll talk about sort of the aesthetic and conceptual underpinnings of the project, just sort of the things that I sort of hope to achieve with the project on an artistic level. And then we'll talk a little bit about the technical details, followed by a demo. And usually I leave the demo to the end, but this time I put it in the middle because there's some other things that I wanted to address that kind of, it helps if you know how it sounds to sort of reflect on that. So without further ado, as Andy mentioned, my name is Miggy Torres. These are my credentials, if you care about them. I studied for here at IU, and I also studied for a summer in IRCAM in France at their Center for Electronic Music. And my music tends to be pretty interdisciplinary, but I'm really just interested in creating kind of immersive experiences for audience members and things like that. I also want to introduce you to Amatria, if you're unfamiliar with the sculpture. So Amatria looks like this. It is a giant sentient sculpture, quote unquote, that hangs from the 4th floor of Luddy Hall at IU. And it was designed by the Ontario-based Living Architecture Systems group led by Philip Beesley, the architect. It is basically a set of fractured spheres with a polymer mesh canopy that is equipped with sensors and actuators that enreads visitors in the surrounding architecture. And it has sensors and things, and so it can respond to its surroundings with lights. And I'll show you in a minute these little plastic fronds that vibrate that let it make sort of this sound of like wind through leaves, as well as sounds through its speakers. So this is a schematic of where the speakers are. If you're looking sort of from a top-down view, if you imagine this is the staircase, and these are, oopsie, my mouse is very sensitive. Let me go back. And these are all the speakers, where the endpoints of these lines. So there's 3 speakers in the big sphere, 1 speaker in the small sphere, and then 6 that are kind of splayed across the spar field over here. This area, we call it the spar field. In today's demonstration, I've set it up so you'll be able to experience a kind of simulated version of this. The piece includes an ambisonic module, so it'll sort of sound as though you're standing where all of these intersection points are. So just bear that in mind for the demo. And then this is sort of a close-up of, you can see there's 1 speaker, and then these are little acrylic fronds, have little motors attached to them, which can help them vibrate in different ways and create a really, really lovely sound. So what is Autopoetic Bloom? Autopoetic Bloom is a mood-based gestural improvisation engine for multi-channel living architecture systems. It is a suite of 24 or so improvisational schemata, as well as custom software for the real-time interpretation and performance of those schemata by compatible living systems, or living architecture systems, in this case, Amatria. So with Autopoetic Bloom, Amatria can compose and perform a musical work that's unique every single time. Each improvisation is a non-repeatable event, an expression of uniqueness of identity, and most importantly, an opportunity for human connection. And the uniqueness of the aesthetic experience implicitly connects listeners as they experience together a shared musical event that will never happen again. So we can sort of dive right into the conceptual underpinnings of the piece. I started as my point of departure asking some of the same questions that Living Architecture Systems Group, the folks who made the sculpture, that they had been asking as part of their ongoing research. And I did that because I really wanted to create something that could really be integrated with the sculpture itself. You could theoretically just create any sort of 10-channel piece, but I really wanted something that could coexist peacefully and in harmony with the sculpture. So the central questions to their research are things like, can architecture integrate living functions? Could future buildings think or care? How do humans respond to these evolving interactions in a process of mutual adaptation? And so I took these questions a little bit further in my own direction and asked things like, can living architecture help people create social or parasocial relationships with their environments? What would the nature of those relationships be? How can living architecture mediate social relationships among people? What role does sound play in that mediation? And how can people connect with each other through a shared sound environment? And so in coming up with these questions, I ended up coming up with a list of desiderata for the project. And you'll notice I'm qualifying that word with the term phenomenological. And that's because I'm really most concerned with how people experience the work. I'm less concerned with like the ontology of the system, of like what the system actually is under the hood. I think that's all really interesting, and I think it's really cool. But the most important thing for me is how people actually experience the artwork. So we'll go through these one by one. So first, I wanted to create a musical experience that allows people to deepen their relationship with the architecture of Luddy Hall and with each other as mediated through their relationship with Amatria. So I want to talk briefly about time and space as a mediator of human relationships. So does anyone here recognize this? Does anyone recognize this pic? I don't know if I can see everyone's hands because I'm sharing my screen, but if you do recognize this pic, it's probably because you went to Cornell University or maybe Ithaca College, because this is a pic of Cornell University. This is a place called The Slope, and it's a spot in Cornell that has an incredible view. And you can see over here on the right, we have the lake, which is Cayuga Lake, and the sun sets across this hill or over this hill. So I didn't take this pic. This was just a pic that I found. But I have gone walking around Cornell many, many times. And one evening in 2015, I was walking by the slope, and I noticed that the sunset was especially beautiful that evening. And I decided I was just going to stop and watch the sunset for a while. And as I was standing there, people were, walking around, and I noticed after a minute or two that someone had stopped a few feet away from me and started watching the sunset as well. And after a few more minutes, another person, and then another person, and another person. And suddenly we had maybe like half a dozen people all standing there watching this sunset. And then the second that the sun went over the horizon, we all kind of just silently dispersed. And it was this really beautiful moment where we were all sort of being connected by this unique aesthetic experience. We didn't say anything to each other. We didn't know each other. We didn't really have to, but we could still feel really connected through being able to experience this thing as a group. So that was a big goal of mine for this project, inspired by that experience. Next was that I wanted to create a musical experience that deepens the sense that Amatria is alive, to create a sense of biomimesis, and this is sort of where the title for the project comes from. So I was really inspired by Amatria's behavior engine, which controls her lights and the vibrating plastic fronds. The way that behavior engine works, the exact behaviors are influenced but not explicitly controlled. So you can specify them parametrically at a high level, but you can't explicitly say, I want this light to turn on right now. You can do things like tell it, how bright to make the lights, or you can tell it how frequently to turn them on, or things like that, but you can't say, I want this light to be turned on right now. Another thing I wanted to do is to kind of help personify the sculpture. I mean, we already referred to the sculpture as with the feminine pronoun and say she, which helps to personify it. But I was thinking, how can I do that through a musical project? So the goal here was to give Amatria agency over the music, so that she's sort of capable of introspection, and she can decide what to sing, and she can decide when to sing, and that could really center Amatria as the composer of the music. In many ways, the ability to create something implies life, and especially the ability to make choices about what you're creating implies life. And so therein lies the inspiration for the title, Autopoetic Bloom. The word autopoiesis, if you're in the field of complex systems theory or cognitive science and some parts of biology, you may have heard this term before. It comes from the Greek auto, meaning self, and poiesis, meaning creation or production. And the idea is that it's a way of describing a living system. Components using its own components. So fancy word, but that's what it means. And so here, the word is used metaphorically. Autopoietic bloom isn't an autopoietic system in the strictest sense, by no means. But from a metaphorical sense, it is, in the sense that as Amatria gives life to music, the music gives life to Amatria. The idea that the music is, it makes us feel as though she's creating it, and so that kind of gives us the feeling that she's alive. So these next three I might just sort of go over very, very quickly because for the sake of time. Number 3 here was I wanted to situate the observer in the same sacred time and space. The term sacred here comes from sort of anthropological understandings of what sacred is. But the general idea was that I wanted to kind of blur the line between when you are experiencing the art and when you're not experiencing the art of Amatria. I wanted to sort of blur the boundary of where that artistic experience is. Number 4 is pretty self-explanatory, just something that has a life beyond a single performance, so it's different every time. And then finally, I wanted something that would respect and preserve Amatria's artistic identity as a sculpture and quasi-living thing. So I wanted to get out of the way of her original sound design. So cool. Let's dive into the technical details here. So in designing this software, I knew I had to have a few things at the beginning. So I wanted it to be able to think like a musician, as opposed to, say, thinking like a computer scientist or like a mathematician. The ways of processing data needed to be musical from the very beginning. And so there were a minimum number of necessary modules that it would need to have in order to work properly and be musical in the way that I wanted it to. It also needed to be flexible and extensible so it can integrate with Amatria's existing systems, as well as any systems that it may eventually get, because Amatria is always growing. So, for this piece, all the improvisations are predefined parametrically at a musically high level. Again, I was inspired by the behavior engine of the sculpture. And so I wanted to do a similar thing, but with music. So what happens is that the different parameters for each improvisation are selected in response to local weather patterns. So why local weather patterns? That might seem a little bit arbitrary, but really this point here about Amatria responding empathically to people without collecting biometric data, that's a really important, that was a really important thing to me with this piece. If I want a sculpture that's going to respond to her environment, how is it going to get that information? How is it going to be able to understand like what the overall mood of a community is? Well, you can either, get really big brothery and try to surveil people and collect biometric data, whether that biometric data is extremely personal, like your blood pressure or your heartbeat, or if it's maybe more superficial, like are you smiling or not. There's the specter of Big Brother is still hangs very thick in the zeitgeist, and even more so nowadays when we know that tech companies are constantly harvesting our data. So I wanted a way for the sculpture to relate to people on an emotional level, but in kind of an indirect way. And so with weather patterns are things that happen every day that we might not think about very, very often, but they can very greatly affect our mood. And so that's sort of the thought process there behind having her tap into weather patterns and use that data to determine how she improvises. So the parameters can be defined by anyone, but only Amatria can author the actual music in the sense that she is making musical decisions on a granular level, even though on improvisational scheme twice, the overall kind of emotion and flavor of it will be the same. Cool. So let's talk about the actual software components here. So we have an activation manager, which basically just turns it on and off. We have the weather data retrieval system. We have a growing library of what will eventually be 24 parametrically defined improvisational schemata. We have the improvisation engine itself, which is really the star of the show, and we have an ambisonic spatializer that you will be able to that we'll be using so that you can actually hear this in sort of like a a 3D kind of sound. And then on top of that, we also have a visualizer, which allows you to even more closely visualize what's going on if you're sort of standing in front of the sculpture, or even like if you're here at home and you want to have a better idea of what speakers are playing what voice. So the whole thing was coded and built in Max MSP. For anyone who hasn't heard of Max MSP, it's a very, very kind of industry standard program for doing anything with live electronics. And there's also a video component that a lot of people use these days. Mine doesn't really use that, but it uses all the audio stuff. And it also makes use of a few libraries, Bach, Cage, and Spat5, which I'll explain what those are a little bit later. So this is a diagram of sort of the information flow in Autopoetic Bloom. It looks a little bit complex, but really the main important things are these four modules. So the idea is that your data from the improvisational scheme gets loaded into this module here, which sort of distributes real-time values to all the other modules. Meanwhile, your main gesture, the main musical gesture that's going to be used in a particular situation, moves through all of these transformations and then gets sent over to the synthesizer itself, which then will send that to the channel mixer and then out to the speakers. So pretty straightforward. I want to talk first about Donatoni generator. So this makes use of the Bach library for Max, which is a computer-aided composition package for Max. So it's really just a large set of Max objects and abstractions for working with musical structures algorithmically, written by Andrea Agostini and Daniele Gysi. And the wonderful thing about Bach is that it uses Lisp-like linked lists to represent musical data. A Lisp-like linked list is essentially just a nested array. It's an array inside of an array inside of an array. And that works really, really well for communicating musical data and for representing musical data, because music is such a hierarchical thing. You have notes and you have chords and you have melodies and you have measures. And so all these different components exist on different levels, different hierarchical levels. And so it's a really wonderful tool to use for representing and transforming musical structures. So Donatoni, which is the gesture-based note generator, manipulates these lists in real time and then sends 4-voice MIDI data to the synthesizers. So when the information comes out of the the gesture-based note generator, it's just music data. It's not sound yet. It has to go to the synthesizers to turn into sound. And there are 4 voices. I could have done more voices. I suppose it could technically support up to 16 voices because MIDI has 16 channels. But if 4 is good enough for the Beatles, it's good enough for me. So next I'll talk about the multi-channel synthesizer here, which I've named Syrinx. A Syrinx, by the way, is an organ inside of some species of birds that let them sing 2 notes at once, basically. So Syrinx is a set of 4 parametrically controlled synths, 1 for each Donatoni voice. Each voice supports up to 4 simultaneous control signals to shape sounds dynamically and improvisationally. The core is a very, very flexible semi-modular synth. And you can also use sample sounds in Absinthe 5, so your possibilities are basically endless. That really is the core of each one of the modules. And so you can what's really good about Absinthe 5 is that you can build your instrument, if you will. You can build your sound in advance, and then when you go to call the sound, you just call a preset. And so it's very little. You don't have to send tons of information through the system. You can just tell it what preset to use, and it'll automatically call that up. So super helpful. And then finally here we have Quincy, which is the dynamic mixer. So what Quincy does is it takes the signals from Syrinx's 4 voices and it distributes them to Amatria's 10 speakers. And it does so in ways that can change over the course of a song, of a piece. It can do so improvisationally, algorithmically, and in tempo. So this uses similar algorithms as Donatoni to represent speaker configurations as Lisp-like linked lists and manipulate those in real time and then decode them into actual ons and offs and ins and outs and things like that. So if we were to take all of these things together, right? Quincy plus syrinx plus Donatoni, the note generator, the synthesizer, and the channel mixer, it would sound really cool, but it would still sort of just be a sophisticated programmable wind chime, in the sense that you would have it doing this one thing for 5 minutes and then it would stop. But it wouldn't really have a sense of trajectory. And so I really wanted something that could turn the wind chimes into a musical aesthetic experience, to turn sound events into organized musical work, to turn noise into a song, soundscape into narrative, what Eric Satie might call furniture music into something we might call concert music, and from recitative into aria. And so it needed to do that. It needs something that can create kind of an overarching formal organization, or something that can allow the music to transform over time. And so the solution to this is Zoe, which is the interpolation engine. Zoe is the Greek word for life, which is where that comes from. And the idea behind Zoe is that it imbues each unique song with artistic intent. With Zoe, you get dramatic trajectory, motivation, shape, transformation, metamorphosis, all can be interpolated over the length of the composition. So you can sort of think of it as, you can think of each improvisational scheme as sort of an n-dimensional graph where n is 235, where each of those is a single parameter that is sort of changing or being interpolated over the course of the piece. So with this module, Amatria can now improvise music that has climaxes and beginnings and middles and ends and narratives and nadirs and accelerandi, etc., instead of just doing this one thing and then stopping or whatever. And because of the way it's written, the number of points between which it can interpolate are virtually endless, although presumably you wouldn't want too many. But the point really is that each song can have its own shape, which is really important. So I think now I'll demonstration. I'm going to share the screen on my other computer. Oopsie, because that's where it is. Actually, before we do that, there are a couple of slides I just want to show you to prime you for what you're going to hear. So this song is let me go over here. The piece you're going to hear is the song that's associated with the rainfall weather pattern, and this form especially showcases the improvisational process. Especially in the second voice, which you'll hear as a kind of playful, percussive kalimba-like sound. And you'll also experience this kind of in stereo, as if you're standing at, in situ in front of the sculpture. Great. So that's Autopoietic Bloom for you, or at least that's one of the many songs that it can create and that the sculpture can create. Next, I want to talk about Peripatetic Bloom, which is simply Autopoietic Bloom on the road. I had the pleasure of bringing Autopoietic Bloom with me this summer to the Neefnor Festival, which is a contemporary music festival in Knoxville, Tennessee, where two of my pieces were premiered, and Autopoietic Bloom, the mobile version, was installed in the Natalie L. Haslam Music Center there in Knoxville. There was a quadraphonic setup, so it wasn't 10 speakers, it was just 4. But the ambisonic module worked the same way as it did today. And then we projected images of Amatria, Luddy Hall, and of Mood Oracle, which is the visualization system that you only saw for like a minute or two. And this was installed for 7 days, and about 40 or 50 people came through, and it was really great. But the highlight of Autopoietic Bloom's time at this festival was a collaborative improvisational performance where several of the performers there wanted to play music with the sculpture. So these folks included Liam Flaherty from Carnegie Mellon, Armand Dorsey from Dartmouth, and Susie Ling from Duke, who are all on these various instruments: piano, clarinet, and toy piano / melodica. So I want to play just a minute of that. This is a really long recording, but I'll just play a short bit of it so you can hear what they did. Oh, I have to share. Hold on. I think I have to share my sound. My bad. Let me do this again. Stop sharing. New share sound. Okay. Here we go. Oops. Needs to go back to here. Okay. Can you hear that? So I'll pause it there for the sake of time, but you get the idea. Really beautiful. These musicians are much more used to doing way more crunchy, dissonant stuff. So I think it's nice that they're kind of trying to. You can hear them trying to inject some of that into the sound, which I think is really lovely. Great. And then finally, to conclude, I want to talk about the preliminary impact on the Luddy community. I say preliminary partly because, as I mentioned, there's still some audio issues with the sculpture that are sort of inhibiting Autopoietic Bloom from really being as stable as it could be. And then also, there's only this one, so far there's only that one improvisational scheme composed, so there's a lot more composition to be done before it really becomes its complete self. But I had an experience recently where I think it was in May of this year, where I was showing off the sculpture to a friend of mine, and I was showing them Autopoietic Bloom as well. And I went into the control room and I pushed play and I came out and we stood there and we listened to the piece. And after a minute or two, a couple of students started to peek their heads out of the focus rooms, and then a minute later, they would start walking up to the sculpture, and after a few minutes, by the middle of the song, we were all standing there underneath the sculpture and listening to the piece. And after it ended, we all dispersed away in silence. And so it was the exact same thing that happened here at Cornell. And for me as an artist, it was just one of the most validating experiences in the world, that the thing that I wanted to have happen actually happened.
All right, for the time being, let's hang on to those questions, because we do need to give Philip really, some time to take the floor. Write those down, really, and Philip, if you would go ahead.
To get Autopoietic Bloom to
thank you so much, colleagues. I hope that you can hear me.
And I forgot why.
And I'm going to open my screen right away. This talk is called "My Body, My Open Body Within an Open World," and I hope that you'll find that it resonates very deeply with what we've just seen with the extraordinarily beautiful work, Miggy, that you've shared.
Big thank you to IU.
What I will be speaking about is
just
a group of people, the Living Architecture Systems Group, and
for the invite here
a series
today.
of projects
and a big
which revolve around new models that suggest that
how to use the software
we urgently and sensitively need to find mutual relationships within a very, very fragile and strained world. What I'm going to share is something that's rather optimistic, and it's embedded in some new work that springs from Amatria, showing a new test bed that is now in process at TU Delft, embedded with tools and frameworks for the distributed immersive kinds of work, and a film called Cradle, which is sprung out of that. And I hope that demonstrates some new paths that allow us to really, in a very practical way, build the relationships that we hope for here. There's something delicious about this talk being embedded within Caddy's beautiful symposium, and embedded in the practice of constructing body models. This is a STEAM presentation, that is to say, art embedded in science, technology, engineering, and math, and it is framed around the building up of many tools which allow common access and participation for building an architecture. Quite complex worlds can be made, and yet it's possible for those to be extraordinarily simple and build them up. And I think that must surely has a resonance with the kind of sound work that Miggy has shared as well. The work starts with a sense of great strain and an acknowledgement that the world is fragile and trembling. The work starts with a sense of apprehension about existing ways of responding to the world, the sense of architecture, for example, stripping away the world and making things hardened, and perhaps of making shells and clear things and boundaries and truth and optimal systems that surely are good for those that live within those systems, but surely are very, very questionable for those that are excluded. The wish to somehow start to work with individual touch and intimacy, and the sensitivity that our own beings lie in multiple fragile boundaries that surely lie within us, as well as outside our own bodies, as well as at large domains as well. This rather lovely sense that if we listen and open, our identities can start to fray and tumble, and perhaps breathe and have a sense of connection with the world in which our own identities are deeply, deeply resonant with the surround. I love the sense of the sunset and the sunrise, and the sense that Miggy shared with us already. Perhaps that can work in constructing some new models in which multiple dimensions are shared and very deliberately constructed, in the sense that architecture and sculpture and music and the plastic arts and so many other dimensions can very deliberately build multiple layers and octave relationships that start to address the pressure differentials and the multiple living realms as well around us, in a deeply interwoven kind of matrix with meticulous control and sensitivity. This results in a very optimistic sense that architecture is possible today. Let me show you some of the practices of building up this kind of vision, starting with very simple individual units that work geometrically, starting with workshops and participation. These are the kinds of activities that built Amatria. Here we are in Delft in this past year, sharing some of the practices that were developed with Amatria with new groups of students and communities. Building those into coral reef-like variations and garden-like elements and disposing them on scaffolds in order to build quite resilient new networks, turf-like great hovering reefs, which gather all around us. Investing those also with some actuation, some electronic controls, and making them quite unapologetically fragile so that they can vibrate and so that they can resound. The result of this kind of work of building very gentle systems that are full of resonance and vibration and harmonics is to create quite large veils which start to envelop us. And you can see some of the work in Poetic Veil, which extends the work of Amatria, hovering above us in these images. This is a new test bed that's just at the very beginning of development. And so this is some small initial prototype fragments that I'm sharing here in work, producing a sense of a kind of a shimmering, whispering presence. New tools, Miggy was describing some of them, have been developed in order to allow weather-like systems to shimmer through this work. And it begins with very small individual acts that then emergently become large networks that are very substantial. By working with individual behavior profiles and then chaining them together and building them very systematically, large-scale weather-like complexes that reach far, far beyond our individual bodies into the surrounding atmospheres, sweeping through us, and working with quite meticulous control becomes possible. And these then matrices and these interfaces are the ones that are now in development and are very hopeful can be invested back into Amatria. Here's the result of this kind of work. When we have individual acts, as we can see within this individual sphere, this comes not only from pushing and scripting and performing, but also from great presences that reach from outside the system as well and sweep through it. Accompanying this now is some quite innovative new work where a digital model is built rather meticulously that doubles the rather carefully crafted individual acts. And these then have projection mapping displayed on them through data projectors that are mapped quite precisely to the physical work, producing a digital twin that then allows dreamlike spaces to be expanded. I'm sharing just the very first images of a new generation, which creates the sense that outside of the physical forms that we see at Amatria, it's possible now to generate a whole vivid, fertile, blooming world that can be experienced variously with projected light and projected sound and perhaps some augmented reality interfaces as well. We're at the very beginning of developing and sharing this work, but the kind of test bed that Amatria represents is, I hope, something that really fosters this kind of shared creation. Let me share just one more in a film that we developed and released last year called Cradle. And this takes the individual form language of Amatria and a related series of sculptures, and then develops it in a filmic space which speaks both of joy and of suffering. I'm going to let this play just for a couple of minutes, and I hope that you'll enjoy the soundscape as well, and then I'll speak in conclusion.
I have hooves of ivory.
the skies. They rise from the earth. They pour from the rocks. I think that you can see that the emotional range in it moves from almost unspeakable despair about our future into a rather gentle hope and a deep, deep immersion as well. And so this talk has talked about the hope for new models in the practices that rise from the kind of participatory work that Amatria has woven. The attempt is to build some new practices of architecture and design and to create a rather optimistic chorus-like quality of building the world together. The world certainly is fragile. The future is uncertain, but I do hope that this work can be a contribution. Thank you.
Wow, very amazing, Philip. The video is quite powerful. For those who do want to finish it, I was able to find the link through your website here. I'll go ahead and share that with everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And let's see if we could gather any questions. Looking at the chat currently.
Yeah, I think there were a couple further up. I'm going to post in the chat the YouTube version of this presentation. I think there were some issues with audio echo cancellation, so you can hear the non-echo canceled version of all of this through the link that's right there. So I saw a question up here, which I can post. I don't know how you're doing questions, but I can just post this in the chat for everyone. This is from Andrea, I think is how I say your name. I think some of these are for Philip. The only one really that I can speak to here is number 3, which is about time of day. Right now, the way Autopoietic Bloom works, it doesn't necessarily take into account time of day, but it does take into account that different weather patterns occur at different times of day. So for example, you're not going to get mostly sunny at midnight, right? You're going to get like clear or whatever, mostly clear, things like that. Other than that though, it doesn't take that into account, but it does have enough kind of randomness built in where it does have it's something that happens every once in a while, right? It's not something that happens all the time. So I think that gives it that sense of impermanence that you're describing here.
Miggy, maybe I'll echo a couple more responses from the chat, which speak about interaction virtually and in person, and also asking about fractal dimensions of this. Amatria can be understood as a new generation of sculpture and testbed in the sense that it's both a development environment for learning about rather unapologetically fragile, but yet compliant and quite durable as well, open systems, which rather than trying to assert themselves, try to let forces run through them and shimmer and vibrate and work resonantly with the world. And it's quite encouraging to see that those structures, rather than being kind of like disastrously vulnerable, in fact have some of the qualities of, let's say, a weed or a goat in terms of really handling things beautifully. And they also have the quality of imparting a kind of a civitas, a care in the way people are allowed to work. And what that engenders, I believe, is an extraordinarily significant quality of being able to share and live in the world rather than having to push and having to survive and having to cut and having to win. Surely these are qualities that are to be fostered. And I'm very, very interested to see how these structural systems are so very viable They use a minimum of material. They're extremely thin, but they're worked rather carefully with compliant joints, and similarly the emergent qualities of the behavioral systems, that is the individual increments, are quite tough, and so they can build up strong electronic systems as well that can handle a lot of variation. It's still a work in progress. We're going to be fixing the sound this year, and I'm very, very hopeful that Miggy and I and other colleagues will be able to work together in a much more fulfilled participatory framework as well. So it's a work in progress. We're learning about this kind of work. Fractality, yes, indeed. The fractal index of a forest, which has a very particular kind of recursive topology, is very significant to this work. And there's wonderful evidence that by working with this kind of recursive, lovely, granular kind of topology, in which there are many individual parts, and then they scale, and then they scale again, and then they scale again, we can get a tremendously rich, vital kind of environment in which space is full, and yet it's extremely organized. It doesn't just go saturated and flatline. So it's not a swamp, it's not anoxic, it's not eutrophic. It is much more like a rainforest in its aspiration. I'll give a very big shout out to neuroscientist Colin Ellard at the University of Waterloo, who has established that this kind of a fractal index, that is the kind of reticulated, varying topologies of forests, can directly result in memory retention and in a feeling of health and a stimulation to perception. And so there is some, while these are rather gentle artworks, they also are quite serious as architectural propositions.
And just to speak a little bit about fractality in autopoietic bloom, that's something that I think I'd love to do more with in version 2.0. The way that autopoietic bloom works now, it's sort of an iterative model. The way that human beings actually improvise music is both iterative and recursive at the same time. You're always listening to what other people are doing, figuring out what you're going to do, and then doing that. And that's something that is much harder to do from a computational point of view, and to make it sound good compared to the iterative model. So for version 2.0, that's what it'll be.
The question about the sculpture evolving, I hope that by showing the work in progress on the screen here, we demonstrate that the work is constantly evolving in terms of being a rather precise system with some eternal parts. I mean, a triangle, for example, or an octagon, or some of the stable polyhedric series are arguably transcendental. And yet the kind of efflorescence, the garden-like quality that comes out of working with those, can pass through new materialities using biomaterials now, where we've shifted almost entirely to plant sugars and polylactic acid and very thin materials, for example. And then the digital twinning work in which some new techniques of machine learning favor curiosity and variation, constantly searching for new patterns, suggests that we're at the very beginning of finding a kind of viability, which really is lively. Now, lively is not the same thing as literally living. Let's not presume for this to be a double of life, but it does use many of the principles from living systems. And those paradigms seem extremely valuable in creating viability in our built world.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you again for joining Philip and Miggy. Feel free to hang around for the next segment. We'll be going over the Human Reference Atlas Basics. It's a compilation of videos explaining everything top to bottom. It will include any introduction along in those videos, so I might just let it ride.
Okay, all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.